Okay, welcome to this evening's masterclass. And today our focus is on the free trade agreements. When you're looking at the free trade agreements, we are going to be looking at them generally today as we delve deeper in the next sessions that we'll be having. And we would like to thank SOCA for hosting this webinar. Without them, it would not be possible. We'd like to thank the CEO, Ricky Aguda, and again, the teams that are working behind the scenes to just ensure that these master classes are taking place. Angela, Lillian, Lydia, who is our main speaker today, as well as the soccer team that is working on the ground led by Winnie. So I would like to first introduce the CEO just to give us a word or two before we get into the presentation. Thank you. Ricky.
Thank you, Nekesa, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Indeed, welcome to this masterclass, where we'll be examining issues around the free trade agreements and what promise they hold for the agricultural sector. SOCA is the host for this particular meeting, and SOCA is basically a membership organization that brings together agribusiness advisors from the crops side of agribusiness, in the sense that we support the crops specific agribusiness enterprises. And our members work throughout the value chains in the sense of supporting with input provision, production support, issues around crop protection, post-harvest handling, market access, and also with matters of finance in agriculture. We promote the use of professional services through a number of ways, and this is one of them, where we provide an opportunity for you and of course even for other professionals to interact and exchange knowledge, and also then improve the overall practice of agribusiness advisory. So I will not waste too much of our time, and I'll just hand back to Nekesa to take us into the matter for this evening. Welcome all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricky, for the introduction. So just looking at the free trade agreements, we know that these are documents or even agreements that are there to ensure we have trade that is taking place, and mostly for products and not services, that are taking place between different countries across the continent, across various countries within the same region. So when you're looking at the free trade agreement, it does not necessarily mean that you're getting any preferential treatment, but it depends on the negotiation you have as a country with the other partner countries that are taking place. So I will let Lydia do just take us through what FTAs are and what benefits we have as a country, or even as a country to engage in FTAs, and what we can do as a country to make better, to get better incentives going out to people to ensure that these FTAs are working. So welcome, Lydia, and introduce yourself. Thank you.
Good evening, Nekesa, and thank you so much. I'd like to thank SOCA this evening for the opportunity, even to indulge on the issues of understanding what FTAs are and the inherent benefits or outlying risks that they hold for the agriculture sector. My name is Lydia Kimani. I'm an agricultural economist. I am presently with the Retail Traders Association as their project coordinator on a food safety project. I am also a member of SOCA, and I'm delighted to be with you this evening. So we have recently embarked on what we'd call a spate of signing free trade agreements. We have had the continental free trade agreements, where we trailblazed by being the first ones to sign and also ratify. There are talks. There is a proposed free trade agreement between Kenya and the US. The negotiations are ongoing. We also have recently finalized on the UK FTA, and that also has its own issues. And this masterclass and this particular presentation will just be looking at the background, what they are, history, the evolution over time. Then we'll also be looking at what are the benefits, who are the winners, who are the losers, some of the free trade agreements that we are looking at as a country, the evolution of extension services in context of the free trade agreements, and then the likely impact on FTAs in agriculture. Then finally wrap up by finding out, are we ready, especially as SOCA, a membership organization that provides advisory services to the agriculture sector, are we ready to provide support to the sector in terms of preparing country positions to submit to government that are going to ensure that the interests of the aspired transformation in agriculture are safeguarded even as we pursue the FTAs. So that is it in a high-level summary. So Nekesa, I don't know whether we'll be sharing the slides from the SOCA side. Please advise.
Please go ahead and share. I think you can do that.
Okay. Just give me a few minutes.
Winnie, would you be able to give her the rights to present, or you can present on her behalf? Thank you.
I think if Winnie is able to present on my behalf, I'd appreciate that very much.
Okay, Lydia, just a minute.
All right.
Maybe as we wait for Winnie to share the screen, what I would probably be looking at is if you could probably talk about FTAs in terms of governments. What kind of role do the governments play, especially when it comes to the free trade agreements, in terms of facilitation and just ensuring that this is working between the countries?
So maybe to begin with, one of the roles that government plays is, for starters, to conduct economic impact assessments. Because when you look at the history from previous FTAs, you realize that they actually said not to deliver the benefits that are sold. So you find that, for example, in the case of GDP, so we find that there is growth, yes, economic growth, but there is deepening inequalities. So it is therefore now, it becomes a prerequisite before the government can embark on an FTA perhaps. One of the things that it should do to even inform its particular position is conduct an economic impact assessment. So I had alluded earlier that with FTAs, we always have winners and losers. So from there, with the economic impact assessment, a government is able to, on the onset, just be able to identify which sectors are going to be losers, which ones are going to be winners. Then from there, evaluate whether that cost-benefit analysis now is worth pursuing. So do the sectors that are going to win present an opportunity to offset a negative trade balance? And are they able to compensate the sectors that are losing out? So that's some of the things that the government should do. And then also ensure that now their positions are based on sound. From the private sector, we have had a lot of emphasis on presenting evidence-based policy recommendations. So even for us as stakeholders in FTAs, even as private sector, then it becomes paramount for us to require of our government to conduct economic impact assessment. Then from there, we are able to already identify, and this should be made public because ultimately this FTA is going to impact all citizens. So this should not be a secret agenda, but should be something that is in the public domain. But from the history of FTAs, you'll find that a lot of them are negotiated. There's a lot of secrecy that surrounds them. So those are some of the things that have almost to say bedevil the nuances around FTAs. I don't know. I think, can we start, Nekesa?
Yes, sure. Please proceed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Winnie. Let's please go to the next slide. So like I had indicated earlier, that is briefly the outline of the presentation this evening. Is just going to be an insight on what we will be embarking on for the next 3 to 4 weeks. So we'll have a history, the rationale, the current FTAs that Kenya is pursuing, evolution of agriculture in Kenya, and those are some of the things that, and this includes even the extension services, agriculture in FTAs, what chapters are most prominent that affect the agriculture sector, the impact of identified FTAs on agriculture, with aspects that are very critical, that is gender, digital transformation, intellectual property, climate smart agriculture, investments in agriculture, among others. Then we will eventually look at a conclusion and a way forward. So let's go to the next slide, please. Winnie? Yes, so the question we start off with is, what are free trade agreements? And they're basically pacts or treaties that are signed between two nations or more than two nations that are seeking to reduce trade barriers between them, both for imports and exports. But you find that free trade agreements, they will not just, at times it's not just, the trade barriers also will refer and address behind the border. And a lot of now what we are referring to as trade facilitation, so issues of simplification of custom procedures, what we have in Kenya as the Info Trade Portal that increases transparency both for exporters and importers, especially with regard to documentary compliance. So these kinds of processes make it easier for trade between two countries. Of course, upon interrogation, you'll realize that there's a bit more. And these are some of the things we will also discover as we go along. Next slide, please, Winnie. So we realize that in order for us to understand the apologies. So I was saying that we must know the past in order to understand the present and to face the future. And in this context, we will be looking at previous countries in our economic status that have signed FTAs, their experiences, so that we can use these kinds of experience to inform our decisions and even, but as in strengthen and reinforce certain positions that we may take even as a country going forward in the different FTAs. So you find that FTAs, we have the official record of the first FTA in 1860, that's in the 19th century, and this was between Britain and France. But you realize that FTAs also existed before that. We had the Ottoman Empire, we had the Roman Empire, and ultimately succeeded. And in all those empires, they had a way in which they traded. So it's just that from the 19th century, they started becoming more formalized and becoming more clear on even the aspects that they were going to cover. So you find that the 19th century treaty between Britain and France already had addressed issues of reciprocity. So meaning that it was not a unilateral, it was only one country that was removing trade barriers, but it was going both ways. We also have the introduction of the most favored nation. This basically means that the benefits that were advanced to one nation are extended to many other nations. Then the national treatment principle is one that states that foreign goods are going to be subjected to the same treatment as domestic goods. So there wouldn't be any differentiation. We see these principles are still present even in the WTO to date. Then after that, we had the great phase of the European free trade. And this was informed by the previous treaty between Britain and and France. So they realized that they were missing out on the kind of trade and trade liberalization that Britain and France enjoyed. and they wanted to be enjoined. Thereafter, we see the First World War and the Great Depression, creating the need for countries to come together and liberalize trade in a way of creating more, increasing competitiveness and efficiency across borders. Then thereafter, we have now the entrenching of the most favored nation principle further through the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. That's the GATT in 1947, which was later succeeded by the WTO. So you find that the WTO now liberalizes trade. So for the GATT, it's focused on liberalizing trade or making trade freer for goods only. But the WTO has expanded this scope. We are now looking at trade in goods, services, and even trade-related aspects of intellectual property presently. We also have other issues like competition and investment still under discussion, but there has not been an agreement or a consensus on those matters as yet. So you realize that the indicators of this evolution are marked by several, and they span different aspects. So we have the level of development. So you find that initially that free trade agreements were normally between developed countries. But over time, this has changed to have this kind of agreements between both developing and the developed countries. And we see that across the Latin America, Asia, and even in Africa. We see a lot of countries now have embarked on FTAs, and even at the African continent through the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. So we find that the geographical scope. So previously, it used to be countries like what we have seen in the 19th century experience, countries in the same continent. But over time, the geographical scope has expanded to have countries in an FTA that are not even in the same continent. So this has been experienced like when we have the US and Brazil in different continents, or we have the UK and the US in free trade agreements and various other examples. In addition, we also have variations. So we realize that over time, we have transitioned from having FTAs that are bilateral, that is between two countries, to plurilateral, which is more several, a higher number, several more countries coming together, and ultimately to the multilateral that is the WTO presently, that has over 190 members subscribed to its agreements, various agreements. We also realize that free trade agreements are also characterized by the levels of integration, and their evolution are also marked by levels of integration. We normally start out with just liberalizing trade in goods and removing tariffs. Then we move on to greater integration where nations come together as customs union, they have a common external tariff, and graduate all the way until they become a political union. Next slide, please, Mimi. So these are some of the ways in which the landscape of the FTAs has evolved. And now for the next slide, we'll be looking at what is the rationale that is mainly pushed or sold when an FTA is being pursued. So you find that one of the things that comes very strongly is the reduced tariff. So this means that goods are able to access a market of a new market with reduced import duties, which also by extension increases the profit margins of businesses. We also have issues of trade facilitation where we are addressing the issues of behind the borders. How much time does it take to clear goods? So these are some of the things that are prioritized. FTAs also portend to present high quality goods at very low prices because we have the aspect of comparative advantage where countries are encouraged to produce what they are best at and then import that which they cannot produce very well. We also see the concept of enhanced efficiency through increased competitiveness. So the countries are encouraged to produce what they are very best at and focus all their investments and resources there. We also see aspects of increased innovation because if local goods are going to face competition from foreign goods, then it means that it is inherent upon the business people in the domestic market to become more creative on how they remain relevant in the market. There has also been the aspect of increased foreign direct investments. However, we see that once a free trade agreement goes into force, we have winners and losers. So we find that a lot of the times the winners are those with are exporters with competitive advantage, workers who gain jobs in the export industries, economic welfare, and then consumers who benefit from cheaper import prices, domestic farms who see higher demand from consumers who now have more disposable income due to cheaper imports. And then consumers also who enjoy lower prices due to competitiveness. Then we also have losers. A lot of the times this has been the domestic farms who are edged out by more competitive goods which are able to access markets at a cheaper price. And then we also see workers who lose jobs in the uncompetitive markets. Unfortunately, in a lot of FTAs that have gone into force, these workers have been in the agriculture sector. So particular regions which see a concentrated decline in industries. And this is because if you don't have competitive advantage over the country that you're signing an FTA with, then your industries that perhaps are also in the same line of production will tend to close because they've been edged out by highly competitive and higher quality imports of a similar nature. And remember, because of the most favored nation and the national treatment, then you cannot prevent these goods from coming in to allow for your domestic industries to become more competitive. Then you also have social costs. So we have issues of climate change. We have issues of with the reduced revenues by government, they are unable to provide other social services like education, healthcare. So then now that is where the question comes in. How much is the government willing, which sectors are going to be sacrificed at the expense of the ones that are going to win? And is the trade-off worth it? Let's go to the next slide, please. So from this, we will now be looking at some of the FTAs, the free trade agreements that Kenya has been pursuing. So we have already signed and ratified the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. This means that besides endorsing the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, we have already started adjusting our laws in the country to ensure that we meet our obligations under the Continental Free Trade Agreement. And basically that is what ratification refers to. So we have the US FTA, US-Kenya FTA, whose negotiations are still ongoing. And presently, the new US administration has sought to review the negotiating objectives. So we are waiting to see how that turns out. And then we have the recently concluded UK-Kenya FTA that is also looking at, that has also is also gone into the phase of implementation with the ratification underway. But there's a case in court, and there's smallholder farmers cite that the UK FTA lacks constitutionality because it did not observe the principle of public participation as enshrined in our constitution. So you find that with the Africa Continental Free Trade area, Kenya as a country tends to export more manufactured goods into the region. So you find that the manufacturing sector stands a very good chance to also now benefit from the FTA. And then even agriculture, this supports a lot of exports, manufactured exports. So one of the things that we'll be looking at is how will this affect the issues of non-tariff barriers, for example, when we are exporting manufactured as opposed to raw commodities. You find that the UK and the US, there was an article recently about how the macadamia farmers are feeling the heat of the UK FTA with the removal of export taxes. So export taxes put a premium on ensuring that we export processed commodities. And this is consistent with the agriculture sector transformation strategy that is seeking to transform agriculture. The US FTA previously in other jurisdictions has recommended the removal of export taxes. So we are anticipating that should they take the same path even with the Kenyan with the Kenyan US FTA, then we are looking at sectors like livestock and even macadamia suffering losses, because now instead of exporting processed macadamia, processed leather, we are looking at exporting them in raw form, which will also claw back on the incomes of our farmers in those particular sectors. Let's move on to the next one, please, Winnie. Next slide. So to contextualize today's conversation, the agriculture extension service has a very critical role to play in ensuring that the farmers in the country are aware of what exactly these kinds of trade deals portend for them, for business, both now and in the future. So the role of the agriculture advisors is very critical, and in the wake of a stronger presence, where the government has taken a more policy role, where they are developing the policy to govern the landscape in which extension services manifest. So we look at how that has changed over time. So in the colonial period, the extension services was offered as embedded services in addition to subsidized inputs and credit. And this was mainly for the settlers. And then for the smallholders, it was mainly coercive, because in a lot of ways, it was a new concept. Then in the 60s and 70s, we see a transition into conventional extension approach, farmer training centers, integrated agriculture development, and this was mainly through donor-supported programs for the newly installed government. In the 80s and 90s, we start seeing the rise of our horticulture sector, and therefore there's a premium on extension services. So we see the approach of farming systems, we have the training and visit approach, and most importantly, the commodity specific approach. And this was very critical to the success of our horticulture industry, which has continued to thrive and flourish even to this day. But you find that at this point in time, the extension services were heavy on manpower and financial resources. In addition, it was a top-down approach. This was particularly strenuous because at this point, especially in the period of the 80s to 90s, that's when we were implementing the World Bank, IMF structural adjustment programs. And one of the things that they recommended was that the government cuts back and ensures that there's a lean public sector. So this affected sectors like agriculture, whereby we have seen since they were asked to stop having more public servants on board, and especially the extension service. So you realize that even now, the extension service providers, workers we have had are those who were employed at that era. We have not had any coming on board. So this affected our agriculture because with the liberalization of those, with the cutting back and requirement to trim the public sector, it introduced a concept of cost sharing, which is what we are seeing now post the 2000, because the government could not afford now providing extension services. This has a heavy bearing on the productivity of agriculture because we had an underdeveloped private sector, largely composed of smallholder farmers. So the smallholder farmers were previously organized into cooperatives and supported by marketing boards that were run by government. But with the exit of government in some of these roles like marketing, without proper transition, a proper transition plan, then we had an institutional vacuum. So the private sector where farmers would take produce as a unit now would go individually. So it became very expensive, and even the cost of extension became very expensive also. So presently, the government with the National Agriculture Sector Extension Policy, NASEP 2012, has reviewed that approach, and we are presently implementing the pluralistic approach. So where we have government providing NGOs and even the private sector. And this is the NGOs and the private sector are coming in to supplement what the government was providing. So with that background on how the extension services has evolved, apologies for that. We will be looking at how this plays into the conversation of free trade agreements. So we look at agriculture in free trade agreements will mainly feature in the chapters that I have highlighted on the right. So that is market access, the sanitary and phytosanitary, technical barriers to trade, compoundly referred to as the non-tariff measures, investment chapter, intellectual property, environment chapter, digital trade, financial services, and government procurement. Some of these I have just picked from some of the chapters that are an area of focus for the US FTA. So you find that with market access, you have the issues of tariffs. SPS, we have the issues of compliance to food safety, plant health, animal health, and then TBT covers labeling, investment aspects that affect agriculture, issues of land lease. IP is in the access of agrochemicals, and also seeds. We know that especially like in horticulture, you have to declare the varieties that you're planting, and if their IP rights to their breeders' rights, you also need to pay up before you can even go into production. Environment, this mainly will cover the unregulated fishing. That is what is normally covered there mostly. Then digital trade, we have the issues of e-commerce. Financial services, we have the issues of access to finance. Government procurement is when government procurement is opened up even to foreigners. So, and this is particularly important because for us as Kenyans, because we know we have a preferential scheme for women, youth, and persons with disability, just as a way of supporting them into economic independence. Next slide, please. So once we have that background, then we need to also evaluate what will be the impact of FTAs in the agriculture sector in Kenya. So you realize that we are now operating in a very climate vulnerable space, even as the agriculture sector. We also are the contributors, the largest contributors of greenhouse gases at 43%, according to the Climate Smart Agriculture strategy. Then we will also need to understand how will the aspects of digital transformation and their presence in FTAs affect the productivity of agriculture. This is now looking at precision agriculture, where we are leveraging on big data to just inform investment decisions in agriculture. The ASTGS highlights that a lot of production in the country is by women. So we need to understand how will the FTAs affect the women in agriculture. We may say that they may have access to exports in a foreign market, but then when we remove tariffs and grant market access to goods and reduce the revenue that government is collecting, how do we impact on the health of these women, the ability of educating girls? How will that be impacted with that shrunk revenue resource? Then we also have the aspects of the non-tariff barriers. This is mainly SPS and the TBT. We now realize that while tariffs have reduced significantly in their impact on international trade, 90 non-tariff measures, that is SPS and TBT, have grown to impact international trade to a staggering 90%. And you find that being a developing country that predominantly exports raw commodities, we are subject to be impacted by these kinds of non-tariff measures. So how are we preparing our sectors? How are these FTAs promoting the export of processed products so that we address the issues of the non-tariff measures, the SPS and the TBT issues? Then we also need to understand, how will FTAs impact agriculture? Will they favor domestic investors or foreign investors? So we need to understand who gets favored and how do we balance the skills. Finally, for us in agriculture, besides the access to agrochemicals and seed varieties of high quality, we are now also looking at the aspects of IP and specifically on geographical indications. We've already expressed interest to protect our tea and coffee under GIs. So this is where they get to fetch premium prices because of their geographical location that grants them the unique taste. We have often heard that our tea and coffee are used to blend other varieties that are of a poor quality. So we want to ensure that our farmers are fetching premium prices. But how is that going to be affected? by the implementation of free trade agreements? What have previous jurisdictions experienced? So we are moving to the home stretch. And the last slide, Winnie, if you may. So at this point, with all those issues being highlighted, now for soccer, the question now the question for soccer stands is that given that we have issues of reduction of tariffs, we have issues of investment, we have issues of SPS, we have issues of digital trade. How is soccer prepared to support the agriculture sector to ensure that positions that are presented to government safeguard the productivity, the envision transformation, while still pursuing these kinds of trade agreements? In addition, how is soccer preparing in terms of building capacity? Do we have capacity resident within soccer that understands some of these chapters that are very critical to the agriculture sector, that are very prominent in FTAs across regions, to be able to advise the farmers accordingly? So these are some of the things that we will need to ponder on even as we embark on this journey for the next 3 weeks, so that we are able to adequately advise our governments. And as a parting shot, I'd just like to share an experience that you find that with a lot of developed countries, FTAs are usually used as tools by the private sector through their governments to advance their interests. So we need to ask ourselves, in a country where the private sector is largely informal, tagged at between 75 to 80%, a lot of the private sector who are MSMEs and in the space of agriculture, smallholder farmers, to begin with, do not know what FTAs are. So how are they able to even start understanding the likely impact of these kinds of trade agreements on their everyday business? And also, we are looking at implementing free trade agreements post-pandemic. We already have lost more than 1 million jobs. Our economy is barely as in hanging in there. We are moving into a level of debt stress, meaning we are not collecting enough revenue, and whatever is collected is being used to offset loans. So for us in the agriculture space, is there enough revenue even to ensure that we are meeting our commitments, such as the CADAP? We have committed to do 10% investment of public expenditure for a 6% return in the agriculture sector. With these kinds of scenario, are we in a position to still pursue ambitious, reciprocal free trade agreements with developed countries? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lydia, for that wonderful presentation and also the knowledge you've shared. And there are a couple of questions that I would like to pick, especially from the participants. And the first question comes from Angela. How do domestic farms get involved in the agreements to ensure that we are not being left out? I know you've mentioned about the private sector, domestic farm. And when I talk about the domestic farm, in my view, I'm looking at that trader, that SME, the real SMEs that we can actually say that are SMEs, not the corporate world, but the SMEs. How do we get this involved in the agreements to ensure that they're not being left out in all this part of this arrangement? So maybe you can take that before I ask the next question.
Okay, thank you very much, Nekesa, for that question. So I find that for us, for SMEs to be engaged and to be involved, they need to be in organized groups so that we are able to comprehensively understand what their needs are and even the impact. You realize that now when you're asked about data on SMEs, it is almost non-existent. Why? Because of their informality. Even government is not able to track who is an SME and who is not. So to begin with, as advisors, we need to start letting them see the need of coming together. So that, because this is an advocacy, having their voices heard in the space of an FTA is a policy advocacy issue. So, and you know that with advocacy, it's the numbers that count. So it's important for them to start getting organized into associations that understand the place of advocacy and lobbying government, that start to appreciate the value that advocacy adds to their businesses. And then from there, they will be able to get their voices heard. And in addition to that, they're able to put together submissions that are backed by evidence that now the government can listen to. Thank you very much.
Then, as you mentioned about winners and losers, the package that we are getting in terms of government, of course, there's an assessment to see the winners and the losers in the whole FTA arrangement. But when we are looking at the losers, in totality, what can the government do? Because obviously when you're looking at the list of the items that are under the losers, then these are things that efforts that can be put into place, like efforts that can be made by government, informed efforts that can ensure that we are up to par and convert these losers into winners. What do you think that the government can do on this? And just to tie that in, I would like to also ask a question from James Nderito, which says, what is the value of this competitive advantage?
Thank you very much, Nekesa. So losers, and what can the government do to ensure we don't have losers? So I'll reiterate my first, what I said initially. To begin with, the best place to start is an economic impact assessment. Once you do an economic impact assessment, you will be able to see at a glance who is worse off. Then from there, you compare to what are the government priorities. Hypothetically speaking, I will give an example. If we were to do an impact assessment, for example, for an FTA and found that the agriculture sector is worse off, then we are able to start evaluating what is the contribution of agriculture to GDP, to employment, to other industries. And then now from there, the government is able to find out, is this something that we are willing to trade off? And you will find that from the history of FTAs, even for the developed countries, the agriculture sectors, even for developed countries, are heavily guarded sectors, even in FTAs, because for them, issues, a lot of times there will be required to remove trade barriers, and some of these include the subsidies that make their agriculture sectors produce in large quantities and at a very affordable price. But you find that for us in our country, that is not the case. So we need to understand, once the losers, is the economy able to afford that kind of loss? And again, to this question, I'd like to also just bring in, you look at countries like Brazil, China, Japan, they all have recently signed free trade agreements with the US. And you'd wonder, a country like Japan has the fifth largest GDP in the world, but why would they only pursue a very narrow free trade agreement? Unlike us, who are having an FTA with the US that is covering more than 15 chapters, for the Japanese, it was only covering, I think, 2. So which begs the question, the economy of Japan can absorb the shock of the influx of American goods, but why are they heavily guarding? Brazil, which is an emerging economy, also finalized an agreement late last year on ethanol and sugar only. Why? Because they realize that this is where they have comparative advantage. They can produce better than the US, and therefore that is only what they are willing to subject to an FTA. Otherwise, all the other sectors are going to be disadvantaged. So these are some of the things that we need to be evaluating. Then from there, it will inform our decisions. Are these sectors going to survive being sacrificed for this FTA in terms of jobs, in terms of inequalities, in terms of impact on marginalized groups, in terms of access to basic social services like healthcare and education? Will it affect our economy? Are we able to absorb that shock, or will it be badly off? What is the value of the competitive advantage? And this, James, will depend on which side you are, because competitive advantage will be relative. Because for us, it will be for us who are now starting to venture into export-oriented goods. And I say start because we only have horticulture, and recently we have now livestock being mainstreamed into this. But we need to see more of the agriculture sector moving into exports to leverage our competitive advantage. As a developing country, our competitive advantage is in exporting raw commodities. However, how does that fit with our transformation agenda, for example? So you find that that is where we have competitive advantage. In all the other chapters, in IP, in investment, we are short on finances, for example. So we are worse off. So those are some of the things that you need to understand. Competitive advantage in what context?
Thank you so much, Lydia. In the next 2 minutes, we are going to unmute some of the people who feel like they need to maybe raise questions, and we can allow them to speak. Then just looking at, like, for example, the African continent, you find that we are only trading in between the African countries at 2%. That's data from 2015 to 2017. Then most of our trade is actually out of Africa. So we are exporting a lot of food items to Europe, about 67%. We are looking at Asia, we are exporting about, the business we are doing is about 61%. Sorry, it's not about export, it's about business. Then we're also doing a lot of business with America, about 47%, but only 2% within the African continent. Really, and we are bound to be, from the literatures, we actually net exporters of a lot of raw materials, as you've mentioned. But you see that we are also importing a lot of finished products, and even sometimes importing some of these legumes, like the cereal legumes, the beans, the groundnuts from out of Africa, which are probably from Africa, and then they're coming back to Africa. What exactly can an FTA do, especially within the African continent, to ensure that we are trading more between our countries? We are reducing this cost of trade between the countries. There's a lot of NTBs that are occurring between the countries. What can you mention about this, especially in relation to the Africa Free Trade Continental Agreement?
Okay, thank you very much, Nekesa. And thank you also for helping me answer, because the challenge with trade between African countries is actually non-tariff barriers to trade. And this is because every economy is looking to protect their domestic industries. So that is one of the things that we need to address very seriously. And there has also been, I think it was in an offline conversation where you mentioned, how is it that only 35 out of the total 55 have ratified? And this is also one of the other things, that every country now is looking to grow their domestic industry, and they're not sure that embarking on an FTA would especially in the region, would help promote this endeavor. So, and actually, it has been cited that even within the AFCFTA, the countries that stand to benefit are the large economies: Egypt, Nigeria, South Africa, Morocco. But what are we going to do about countries like Burkina Faso? So that is where you'll find even some of them are also hesitant, because they know outrightly, because of the size of the economies, the inefficiencies they experience, they are likely to lose out. And so that is the challenge. That is one of the challenges that AUC have had, to ensure that they balance out the wins, and they clearly state how they are compensating the losers, so that there is consensus in terms of the AFCFTA. So about the being net exporters, you find that the challenge has been due to an underdeveloped private sector. And we also have economies that are strangled with debt. So you find that starting and doing business in Africa is not as easy. You find in Kenya, for example, for a long time, we had interest rates above 20. Well, when you compare with someone who is doing business in Europe, when you're coming to even invest in the same country, their governments are able to advance financing at between 0 and 3%. So already access to finance gives them competitive advantage over you, even when you're investing in the same country. So these are some of the things that we need to look at. And one of the things that anchored in a report they released last year said that Africa is losing 80 billion in illicit financial flows, and they only receive 50 billion in aid. So if we are able as a continent to, first of all, stem the illicit financial flows out of the continent, then we could start now locking in some of these finance that could be invested in areas like agriculture, and making it more competitive and increasing our productivity consequently.
Thank you so much, Lydia. We'll now open the floor up for questions or comments, maybe 2 or 3, and then we can wind up the session as we plan for the next session. So then just also looking at tariff liberalization, I know that's a really interesting topic to probably discuss at this moment. Why is it that on the African continent, we've really never thought about it? If you look at the Americas, they're trading in dollars. It's the US of A is dollars. When we look at Europe, there's the euro. Until lately, maybe the Brexit happened, but still the euro is quite strong. Why aren't we as an African continent looking at one tariff for trade that would probably generate, liberalize that trade and make us more competitive in the sector, and also in FTAs when we are doing FTAs?
Maybe just to seek clarification, Nekesa, when you say tariff, are you referring to a common currency for the African continent? Because tariff will refer to import
tariff,
duties.
Yeah, there's tariff
import duties,
and then there is also the currency aspect of it. Yes, the two aspects.
Okay,
sorry, yeah.
Okay, with tariff liberalization, we have made significant progress, especially like with our in the EAC. At least we have moved to the point where we have a common external tariff, and in fact, the EAC regional economic community is lauded as one of the best performing in the African continent and very progressive. However, like I had alluded earlier, a lot of countries are struggling under debt. So a lot of them will not want, and you know that when trade happens, especially if more countries are buying from you, then there is a higher demand for your currency. So there is that fear of loss of sovereignty through that currency. When we collapse it into one currency, it is easy for the US because while the US is almost the size of significantly large, they have a common currency, but uniting 54 governments to adopt a common currency is quite an uphill task. And then given those inherent problems, the challenges of debt, you see, and then also the aspects of when one country is, their goods are more, they are in higher demand, then they want to retain that aspect. So that actually has been one of the challenges cited, that in the implementation of the CFTA, the AFCFTA, the multiplicity of currencies is actually going to be one of the greatest challenges. But the Afri-Exim Bank, the Africa Export-Import Bank, working on a modality that is going to ensure that this is harmonized even when currencies are different across countries. But that now is going to be literally tested when now we start actually trading. They'll be able to evaluate how well the new pathway of harmonizing and ensuring that no one loses out, especially in terms of currency and aspects of devaluation. Those will only be tested once it comes into full implementation and trading actually begins. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lydia, for sharing with us the knowledge about free trade agreements. And I agree with you, sometimes we are very fast in terms of signing the FTAs without evaluating the impact that it has on our economy, and especially when it comes to agriculture, which is usually one of the biggest losers when it comes to these FTAs. So we'll be delving deeper into the specific free trade agreements from next week, and we look forward to having all of you on board. Tell a friend to tell a friend to join in the masterclass next week. We need to learn about the implication of some of these agreements that we sign as a country and as a continent. And with this, we would like to wish you a good evening wherever you are, or a good morning if you're waking up, and have a good day or evening. Thank you.